Matthew's on here? How many people on here?
Don't turn around.
Okay, I think we're, I've got the text that we are live and good to go, and it is a little past 10:30, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just for a couple housekeeping items, the mic that is in front of you is shut off or in red. When you speak, please turn the mic on so that those that are watching online or those that are here can hear a little bit more clearly. You'll see the green whenever you are, when your mic is on, and if you push it again, you'll turn it off and so on and so forth. So we'll try and remind everybody to please do that for the sake of those watching virtually. This is the Region 4 Regional Steering Committee meeting for the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. For those that are, here and those that are watching online, we have several consulting folks here sitting in the table in front of us. We have several folks in the audience here, whether from a Gravity Drainage District, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries engineering firm, and engineers from our Public Works Department, as well as staff, making sure that we have all of our minutes and all of our PPE ready and available for those for when it is needed. So that being said, I guess I will call to order the special meeting of the Region 4 Regional Steering Committee for June 15th, 2020 at 10:30 a.m. And I will do a roll call. Mr. Jason Abear was unable to be here. Mr. Jacob Marceau.
Here.
Alberto Galana, I'm here. Cameron Miles Abear.
Here.
Gardner Rose. Tom Funkenberger is here on behalf of Steve Brown as per our agreement, and will be voting by proxy. John Marceau.
Here.
Matt Johns.
Here.
William Ruffin. Carl Thompson. And our at-large member, Kara Boswell.
Here.
We have a quorum. So moving on to item 3, invocation and pledge of allegiance. Usually defer to Mr. Jacob Marceau for that, and we'll do the same.
All right. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Lord, thanks for bringing us together. Please guide our hand, and may our actions benefit all citizens of our region. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
And the flag is to your right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. Item number 4 is consideration of approving the minutes of the regular meeting of the Region 4 Regional Steering Committee dated March 2nd, 2020.
I'll make a motion.
I have a motion by Mr. Abear
Second.
and a second by Mr. Johns. Any discussion? Any objection? That motion will carry. Number 5, included in your packet is a revised regular meeting schedule. This is considered a special meeting according to our bylaws. Based on the COVID-19 delays or interruptions of various services, we have a revised calendar proposed for the Regional Steering Committee for consideration. So at this time, I will take consideration, take appropriate action on a revised regular meeting schedule for the Region 4 Regional Steering Committee.
Mr. Chair, I have one question on December. The 7th is highlighted. I don't know what the yellow is supposed to indicate for us.
I think that's a typo.
I think it's a typo too. I think the intention's the 14th.
So for the record, that highlighted 7 is not a meeting date. Only the ones in the orange are the proposed meeting dates, just for clarification. So I'll take any
I'll make a motion to adopt the new meeting schedule.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Johns and a second by Mr. Marso. Any discussion? Any objection? That motion will carry. We have, let's see. Number 6, item number 6. So this is one of our biggies for those that have here as well as those at home. This is something that we've been working on with throughout the past several months, but it is to receive a presentation and receive report on Region 4's regional flood risk. So to do that, I'll hand it off to Alex, and she will run us through that. And with that, I'll just let you get started.
All right. Thank you so much, Alberto, and thanks, everyone. Good morning. We're excited to be here today in Region 4. We do understand that there is a lot going on right now, but I think we all know that our flood risk isn't going away, right? We're in the middle of hurricane season, and so it's really important that we stay focused on the job of, this steering committee, the work of the Louisiana Watershed Initiative. So I just want to say on behalf of the initiative that we really appreciate y'all coming out this morning, masks in hand. I think we all sat ours aside for just disclaimer for anybody watching online. We did bring them in, but we're all separated. And so, beginning this narrative with y'all is really important to us. We want to make sure we're telling the right story, your story, and we're working to solve the problems that we identify with this group over the next couple of years.
I'm sorry, you're with the Watershed Initiative?
Yes, thank you so much, Jacob. I appreciate that. So to introduce myself, my name is Alex Carter. I'm the program manager with the Office of Community Development. I work for the state. I'm joined by Brad, who's in Command Center, and some support. But I think it's important to know that in this presentation, it's meant to be the beginning of this discussion. We're going to talk about some data, and we're going to talk about what we think we know, with the idea that we want to hear more from y'all and make sure we're getting it right. And if we're missing any pieces, we need to make sure we build those in. So there's been a lot of work up until this point, but by no means are we saying that this is the end. We understand, and let's, even though we do want to get to business, right? We want to get the work done. So just keep in mind that as we work on this, one of the key objectives of the Watershed Initiative is to use data and science to help make decisions about how to reduce flood risk. So we hope this presentation is a resource to help us carry out this work together. The main objective today is to start to build a common understanding of known flood risks, vulnerabilities, and priorities within Region 4 at the watershed region scale. So I think this is important. We know y'all understand your local areas, and y'all are working really hard to address risk within your parish or your towns. What we want to do is zoom up and look at that at the watershed scale and see how all these systems work together. To this effect, we're going to introduce y'all to a tool to build awareness and kickstart this discussion about known risks that leverages your local experience of flooding. All right, I think, let's move on. So y'all, does anybody have any questions? Or Miriam or Jennifer or Alberto, if y'all want to weigh in, if I'm forgetting anything significant,
Well, just to add, all these resources, exercises that are performed here will be available. This is not the end-all, be-all, available online for other members to get acclimated and use these tools, report information. And so in addition to that, all these representatives who represent various respective areas, we do have a little homework to go out there and get information from those from those folks in our areas. So that being said, this again is it's a report, but it will be available for interaction by the public.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. Keep in mind, for those of y'all who are joining, it is a public meeting. We do record these. So as we talk, we just want to be very clear. We're also going to post a closed caption version of this on YouTube. So for people you may know that or have accessibility issues or have difficulty hearing, I just want to make sure, knowing that a lot of people are uncomfortable coming to public meetings right now, we want to make sure we make this as accessible as possible. And we're going to follow up with an an email after that includes links to the presentation, the closed caption version on YouTube, and all the mapping exercises. So if you're aware of someone who wants to weigh in and participate in this conversation, our best advice is to make sure that they're on the Louisiana Watershed Initiatives listserv, which you can go onto our website at watershed.la.gov. And stay connected. That's the click you want to make sure you're getting those email notifications and can participate fully in this process. So just keep in mind, if you're on Zoom, the chat feature will be made public. Both the private and the public comments will be made
You are
public.
muted. You are unmuted.
Okay, great. We do have some time set aside, and we also want to make sure if you're even having difficulty with the Zoom, like we know this, some people have trouble with the chat feature or muting and unmuting. There is also a phone number that you can call to communicate comments about flood risk that we may not be capturing over the phone. All right, or you can email us at watershed.la.gov. All right, so before we start this conversation with y'all, and I know y'all have been talking about this over the last few months, it's important to know that it didn't start over the last few months, right? We started in 2018 with the listening tour, and it's important that y'all understand everything that you tell us, we take very seriously, right? We use your input to change the way this program functions. And so back in 2018, we heard some really important things. We've captured them on this slide, and I think you can start to see how they're manifesting already, right? So one of the things we heard was we need to enable watershed to watershed interoperability. Right? We need to be able to work together, see the system. Part of what we're doing today is responding to those questions back then, right? We also had that it needs to be driven by locals, right? Locals need to drive the planning process. And so today is all about understanding what data is important, what data tells your story. And so we pulled some things up. We're having some technical difficulties. I don't know if this is carrying over to, should I stop? Yeah, okay, great. Because I can just keep going, right? But I think the key here is, like Alberto mentioned, we're going to ask y'all when we're done to do this mapping exercise. And it might seem fluffy, right? It might seem like, why do you want to have us keep talking about our flood risk? It helps us to make sure that we're right-sizing solutions for your region. You've got to remember, we're all across the state listening to all these different regions. And so the more you communicate with us, and this is a back and a forth, the more likely we're going to get the right solutions prioritized and executed in your region. So bear with us if it seems redundant. It's really not. It reminds everybody who may be new to this what's important. Okay, and I think just to kind of cover the agenda for this particular presentation, what we're going to talk about is a flood risk assessment. For about 30 minutes, we're going to go through the data. We're going to take a quick break because by that time, I think everybody's going to they're going to feel a little data drunk, right? We'll take a break, a 3-minute break, and then we'll provide the directions for the group mapping exercise that you'll take home with you. And just keep in mind, you'll have 3 weeks to weigh in on that. So it's not, meant to be overly burdensome, but somewhat reasonable to make sure we're capturing what you think is important. And then we'll do a public comment and we'll do a report out. All right. All right. So in order to, I think, talk about flood risk at the regional level, we all have to make sure that we have the same general understanding of a couple of things, right? The really incredible thing about the steering committees, as I'm sure y'all have realized, is that it's made up of people who may not have traditionally been part of this conversation, right? We tend to rely on engineers, floodplain managers, and what we wanted to really do with the Watershed Initiative was make sure we opened these meetings up and had participants that were not traditionally part of this conversation. So one of the things you'll notice is we spend some time today making sure everybody understands some key terms, some key background around how we talk about flood risk. And then we think about some various risk factors, right? So in Region 4 and in all flood risk, we find historically, you have specific types of communities that are overburdened or hit harder because they're stressed in other ways. And so we want to overlay that understanding with your understanding of risk. And so that's important when you think about how you prioritize your resources in Region 4. We also want to spend a little bit of time just introducing this idea, and I'm sure y'all are already well familiar with this, of working with nature, right? And thinking about this bigger system, all of our assets, and how we can merge our challenges with our opportunities. And for those people who may be new to this, joining us online, I just want to make sure as we have the regional or the statewide map up, that we're in Region 4 today. This kind of goes, we always forget to remind people, we're in Region 4 today, that the state divided itself into 8 regions. And so, just making sure everybody understands this is the westernmost portion of the state that's looking at the Sabine and the Calcasieu River basins. All right. Is there anything y'all want to add, Alberto or Jennifer? All right, cool. Okay. And then just to kind of cover, y'all, like we had said earlier, y'all have been working together. One of the unique things about the Watershed Initiative is we're working across jurisdictional boundaries and recognizing how water moves naturally within the region. And so we want to make sure that we sort of acknowledge the work that y'all have already done, the meetings you've already had, that we have full participation in Region 4, and that's like a very big deal, right? So when we started talking about this at the state level and thinking about asking the regions to work across watershed boundaries and organize this way, we identified a lot of challenges, and I think y'all all deserve sort of a round of applause, essentially, in overcoming those challenges and getting to this point. So we appreciate all that y'all are doing. All right. So to the kind of fun part, right? This is where it gets interesting. We start introducing some new concepts. We did here, and if y'all can see the map, it's kind of, for those of y'all who are looking this way, it may be better for you to turn and look at the ones behind you because they're bigger. But what we've done is we've added the 2 main watersheds, right, or drainage basins that together form Watershed Region 4. On the western side, you'll see the much larger Sabine River watershed with the river kind of at the spine of the system. More than half of the Sabine River and the watershed is in Texas. This is something that originally when we came to Region 4, it wasn't on the map, right? Everybody was like, hey, you're missing half our watershed. So it's really important that y'all see sort of this as an iterative process. The river tracks along the state line. It ends at the southern edge of the Texas-Louisiana border. It does also contain one of the largest man-made reservoirs in southern United States, the Toledo Bend Reservoir. And I think for our purposes, it's important that we're all looking at this and understanding that the reservoir was primarily designed for water conservation, hydroelectric power, and recreation. And you can kind of see as, what we don't want to assume is those in Cameron and Calcasieu are familiar with the northern parts of the state, right? So some of this, you're going to be from these parishes, and this is a no-brainer, but maybe not for everybody. And then you'll see the Calcasieu watershed east of the Sabine. It's sort of outlined in a darker green. It's very different from the Sabine, right? It's smaller. Its main river, the Calcasieu River, is shifted more to the far eastern side, and it's fed by a multitude of smaller tributaries that, hypothetically could take longer to feed into the main river system. So it behaves differently. And so this could make it more complicated to predict how water will move and how rainfall events could impact river heights and flash flooding events. And I think for all of us, it's important to know that what we're talking about right now is hydrology, right? How water circulates throughout our environment through different pathways and at different rates, right? And knowing that these 2 watersheds or drainage basins make up your region, how that water behaves is really important to be able to think about how to address risk. What we also want to do is consider the different ways we flood, right? And you'll see this later on when we talk about different damages. Not all floods are alike, right? So what we'll do is we'll talk about a little bit on coastal floods and surge and tidal flooding. We'll also talk about river floods, when excessive rainfall falls over an extended period of time and causes a body or a river to exceed its capacity. And then we'll talk through some rainfall-induced flash floods or pluvial floods. This is your urban flooding when your urban systems get overwhelmed. All right. And then we'll go into coastal floods. So traditionally, in the state of Louisiana, we've really focused on hurricanes, right? That's been our biggest. We get nailed all the time with our hurricanes. It's our major source of flooding. It's outlined. The coastal area, I think it was supposed to be outlined, but I'm not seeing it here. It looks like it's more outlined in a blue kind of shape. And I think we all know this, right? The areas along the coast, there's been significant investment made by the state to understand this risk because we just keep getting hit. And so we have a lot of good data along the coast. And what it does is it provides us with, I think, a good point of reference for what this could look like if we invested in similar data in the inland areas of the state that are experiencing riverine flooding. We can also take some lessons learned from the coast and think about how projects were developed and implemented and how we could do that similarly. And it's important to know that with the Watershed Initiative, it's not just OCD, right? It's also CPRA, DOTD, Wildlife and Fisheries, the Governor's Office of Homeland Security, all supporting this effort. So all those sort of lessons learned, all that information is at our fingertips and actively working to support this process. Just for everyone's reference, the coastal plan update is expected in 2023, so it's coming around the corner. Its main purposes are to reduce coastal flood risk, promoting sustainable ecosystems, providing habitat for a variety of commercial and recreational activities coastwide, sustaining communities, and supporting regionally and nationally important business and industry. If you're a parish in the coast, this is going to sound really familiar, but if you're DeSoto Parish, right, this might not be something that you're familiar with, so bear with us, guys. And thinking about the data that's available along the coast, let's talk a little bit about what that actually means. The Coastal Master Plan actually has future predictions that they use to help plan for the effects of sea level rise and subsidence, as well as storm surge. So how far the water will go, how deep it will be when it's pushed on shore during major storm events. And so what you'll
Sorry, I
see
have a quick
here.
question.
Yes, good, Jacob.
Yeah, sorry. Do you want comments and discussion as you go through your presentation, or do you want us to?
Yes. So
Okay.
we didn't mention that. I'm glad you're bringing it up. So definitely, I think we want this to be y'all weighing in, like you're saying. Do you have a question?
Yeah, the
Perfect.
only thing I want to add so far, well, not the only thing, but the only thing that needs to be added so far is we adopted a resolution. Your office should have got a copy. We
Great.
adopted a resolution last time we met. We talked about the Council on Watershed Management maybe doesn't comprise all the stakeholders that deals with watershed management. And the key thing is Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry. Still not sure why the council didn't comprise that, because you think about the history of, especially in Southwest Louisiana, a lot of these canals. I mean, the whole reason a lot of these canals and gravity drainage districts were created initially was to either get fresh water onto the rice fields or get salt water out of them. So we did pass a resolution. You should have a copy, and I would just ask for an update on where are y'all at on adding those guys to the council?
So I would say that the way that we work with the other agencies is pretty informal, but it's inclusive, right? So at this point, we do work with USGS and DEQ and Facility Planning and Control. We really need to, I think you're right, bring in Ag and Forestry more into the discussions and the work that the Watershed Initiative is doing. We have discussed it multiple times with the working group. It hasn't, I think, elevated to the council yet. But I think we are aware that this was a request at the last meeting, and we're trying to figure out how formal that relationship needs to be in order to incorporate that voice appropriately, right? And so I appreciate you bringing it up, Jacob, because I think it's a good thing to be reminded of. And I don't know if I have a copy of the resolution, so if y'all could send it over, I think that would go a long way in the discussions that we're having with the working group and making sure they understand that this is an important point to make that's coming from Region 4.
Thank you.
Perfect. No, absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing this up. So if anybody else has questions, just interrupt me, because, I tend to just want to save time, and it's really bad sometimes when we're doing a facilitated discussion. And so, for just kind of thinking about the coastal master plan, it's important because it's well renowned across the country for how to do this well. And so we want to make sure we're pulling sort of lessons learned and also sort of understanding what the data is and how it can be represented and how it can be useful. And so what this is showing on the map right now is it's a prediction of future flood risk projected 30 years into the future, assuming full implementation of the coastal master plan. And so I think when we see maps like this, we really want to put it into the context of sort of business and families and leadership at all levels, and how important it is to understand what areas in your region are vulnerable to flood risk. And it should sort of impact your decision-making when you think long-term investments. And so Brad is doing a really nice job of sliding it sort of back and forth. And so what you're looking at, let's talk a little bit about this, right? He's doing a great job. It's kind of mesmerizing. When we talk about future flood risk, it's important to understand that it's represented as a probability, okay? That takes into account how often a storm is likely to occur and how bad it's going to be, right? In the simplest of terms. So storms of varying strengths and frequencies are represented as a percentage, right? So y'all are probably really familiar with the 1% annual chance event and the 0.2% annual chance event. And so what you're seeing here as he slides across is the 1%. Is the sort of less severe, more yellow looking map. It's still very severe, right? We always have to be careful when we're talking about flood risk. All that yellow is 7 to 9 feet. The blue is 1 to 3 feet of inundation. The green is 4 to 6 feet. Just, for those of y'all who are looking at this and having a hard time reading the legend, the red is 13 to 15 feet. So it's very significant. And then when he rolls it back, it's going to be the 0.2%, right? So this is your 500-year event. It's more severe, arguably less likely to happen. And so just keep in mind this more yellow version is your 1% chance storm. This is, the risk you have. You have a 1 in 4 chance of it occurring in the lifetime of a 30-year mortgage, right? So you're likely going to see these types of events. Hurricane Harvey is an example of the 1% chance in some areas in the region, not all, right? So think the worst hit areas would be the 1%. And then also thinking about that 0.2% to kind of put it into a local perspective. That's going to be more like the effects of the March 2016 event for areas that were hit the hardest. It would be a 0.2% chance. And so, this type of data isn't available north of the coastal zone, but could be, right, as part of the outputs of the modeling and data and mapping program. And so also seeing the difference in severity between the 0.1% or the 1% and the 0.2% to see how that could shift based on that storm's impact is important. Jennifer, I'm sure you want to weigh in. Yes.
And I know it's no longer up, but I think the important takeaway is once it gets up, and Brad can kind of zoom out a little bit, is just to show how far north the coastal effects go. And then also to understand that, it's not a full studied area, meaning there's a limit to where they studied. So it doesn't necessarily show the full flood extents out. Because as you go from a 0.2% to a 1%, you can see that the area, obviously when you go to a 0.2%, the flood extents would be greater, but yet the study area remains the same. So it's really just to show flood depths and give everyone an idea. And then as you can see how far north it goes to Allen, to almost the Allen, Beauregard, Jeff Davis, sort of Four Corners area. So we really have certainly the coastal effects are very important when we're talking flood risk for Southwest Louisiana.
Yeah, and I think when we looked at this too, Jennifer, we were kind of like, what's going on in this northern part that just goes upward into it? And I think you have this transition zone too, in this area of the state where you have riverine flooding coming south and you have coastal flooding coming north, and you might actually see areas that are circulating as a result if these things happen simultaneously. And it's important to know that, the Watershed Initiative and our modeling team understands this and is paying very special attention to how to map and model the impacts of the coastal zone and the transition zone and how these two areas interface during sort of the worst possible scenario in terms of flood risk.
I thought we had pretty good discussions so far. I mean, the consensus we came up with is that, people like me in the northern parishes, we need to hold the water up, up there. Most of our projects revolve around that. And then, the southern parishes get the water out.
Right. I mean, detain, and then there's also a process of moving it outward. You're absolutely right. And I love that y'all are already figuring out, like, what's the game plan? Sometimes it can seem really simple, but if you don't have the mechanisms in place to have those discussions or execute your decisions, then you're still kind of stuck, right? Great.
Just, and to add to that, one of the points that several of the members brought up is that, like you said, the data is available in certain areas. Certain resources are available in certain areas that aren't available in others, and incorporating and trying to move those, whether it's LiDAR data, whether it's rain gauge systems, move those as far throughout the state for our region, move that further north, move that further east, south, everywhere, so that we can better understand how that works and implement projects like Jacob's talking about.
Right. Well, and I think with this slide, you really see how interconnected everything really is. And like having those gauges in place, having emergency forecasting in place to be able to react in real time to something like the rainfall events that happened in March. It's kind of crazy. When we pulled this up, it was really difficult to get this data on this map. So full disclosure, there was a lot of love into this piece. If you look at it, this is the rainfall that occurred during the 2016 events in this region. And it looks almost as if in the middle section, that's where like there was the least amount of rain, because we're not used to seeing these grays delineated in our weather services, right? So just keep in mind, those colors are sort of added because the rainfall was so extreme, 10, 15, 20 inches of rain falling over the Toledo Bend Reservoir and throughout the Sabine and Calcasieu. You can kind of start to think about, well, where is that going to go? How is it going to affect the region? What are the neighborhoods that are connected to these systems? How do they drain? And it's not a localized issue, right? This isn't just something that popped up over a small town and dropped 6 inches of rain. This was over the entire watershed, the entire basin. And so thinking about being able to plan around this and, organize your EOC around what you think are the effects of it are going to be important. Do y'all have anything else y'all want to add on this one?
I wish Vernon Parish was here, because we talked last time about the Sabine River Authority and how we can interface with, or at least develop some kind of relationship with them. And it's not to where we necessarily dictate to them, but man, it sure would be nice to know their plans on high precip events.
Right, and I think this is one of the reasons why we were kind of, when we did the sort of research, looking at just Toledo Bend and the Sabine River Authority, and knowing that those structures weren't built for flooding, right, for flood mitigation. They were built for power and recreation, and you think about that, and so it helps you to sort of understand where they're coming from and what their limitations might be, and put you in a better position of, okay, how do we address those limitations so that we're not in a position of having no answer when we're in a bad situation longer term down the line. So you're right. Yeah.
Hey, Alex.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that for everyone's record, the areas in gray represent 15 to 20 inches of rainfall.
Yeah.
So just so you know.
And that area that's in the middle, that's kind of outlined in blue, is the Toledo Bend Reservoir. Just to make sure we're all. And I mean, the other thing too that's unique about Louisiana is we're so flat. We're so flat, so it becomes more and more difficult to predict where water is going to go when it lands. And so looking at this system, understanding how it interacts with its environment is so important to being able to sort of prepare your communities and reduce flood risk. To that effect, what we're talking about really with the 2016 floods are fluvial floods or river floods. And what we're showing here are historic crests along the Sabine and the Calcasieu that that occurred as a result of all of that rainfall, right? So you think about all that water moving down those systems, where it's going to go, if it's going to be detained, how it's going to get out. And we want to call attention to sort of the data sets that are available to tell us, is this the highest we've ever seen on the Sabine? Yeah, it was in 3 different places, right? So it helps you, I think, understand, do we plan for the 500-year event, or, knowing that we have historic crests that are happening along this river just, a couple of years ago, or do we plan for a different level event? These are difficult decisions about what risk is an acceptable risk, and using these data sets and understanding where they play out on the ground is going to help you make better informed decisions, and then be able to communicate them effectively to the public. Go ahead. Did you have a question? Okay. I'm like watching Jacob's finger to see you're pressing your button. Okay. So just a little bit more, I think, so just to kind of recap this, but what we're seeing with fluvial floods, this is happening all across the country, right? We're having extreme rainfall events. We're having rivers exceed their capacity, flood agricultural land. There's huge economic losses associated with this. And we're seeing higher and more intense rainfall events just across the board. So it's important to think about our data sets too, because our data sets are calibrated to a different frequency. And understanding, do we need to adjust those to reflect what our new norm is? And so a lot of these, we'll talk a little bit more about that with when we talk about traditional FEMA and how FEMA looks at all of this. But we want to put this in the back y'all's pocket. The other thing that was kind of strange about these crests with the Sabine was that they were all in Texas. And so, like, in terms of, it made us ask this question of, like, what does the reporting look like on the Louisiana side? Do y'all rely on Texas for them pulling river crests and then communicating them to y'all? Or is it like, we'll want to kind of work with y'all to understand that relationship you have with them and support it, as much as we can?
Let us know what you find out.
Right. It's, we understand, like, this is about capacity building, but it's also about, like, filling in the gaps, right? If we all have the same understanding, we can just work way more effectively than if we were having this conversation 8 different times in smaller rooms and coming to 8 different conclusions about what the problems are. Okay. Am I missing anything, Brad?
I think you covered it.
Okay.
So everyone's aware, I know so we have the river systems in the blue, and then the yellow dots represent the crests. So the Sabine River is it's the border of Texas and Louisiana on the left-hand side of this map, and these are 3 of the record-breaking crests. And then the Calcasieu River record-breaking crests are on the right side, the 2 dots, yellow dots.
Right, and I think for emergency managers, like this is very familiar, right? We monitor river heights or flood stages, especially for those that work along the Mississippi River with the Corps. But it may be in smaller rural parishes you may not be monitoring your river heights, right? And so this is a question we sort of need to ask ourselves: like, are we watching these things? Is there anyone in your town that's aware that this data may be collected in other places? Are you noticing your river heights are higher? And you just are making a mental note, like, that's higher? Or can we help document that information and collect that data to help tell the story of what's going on at Region 4 so we can better figure out what are the solutions?
Just on behalf of, I don't represent Allen Parish, but I got cows there, so I can speak for them. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when this flood event happened in 2016 on our side of the state, I mean, tides were really high, right? Engineers have told me that. Plus, they had some stuff going on with the saltwater barrier. I mean, there's so much. And on the Sabine, I guess there was some stuff going on, cooperation. Nobody was talking, as far as what rate are we going to release from the reservoir. We already know the Sabine's getting deeper and narrower, and the velocity's increasing anyway, comments complete.
Right. I mean, if you know that the water's coming down more quickly and you have a high tide and it has nowhere to go, right? Where is it going to spill outward, right? Where are the locations that those rivers might overspill their banks first, right? And so I think there's already modeling work happening with Calcasieu and the Cameron parishes, and there's a lot of understanding around this, but I think pulling it up to the transition zone is sort of a next step, and better understanding that complicated relationship around river flows and tidal surge. It's a really good point. That's, I would say, in the engineering community, there's a lot to unpack there, right? Not being an engineer, full disclosure, not an engineer. And so I think the next piece that we want to make sure everybody's thinking about, so we talked about coastal floods, which are surge, tide, wind. We talked about river floods. It's excessive rain over long periods of time with rivers overspilling their banks. Pluvial floods with a P, right? Pluvial floods. Sounds just like fluvial, like whoever did that, it was cruel. These are also rainfall-induced floods. So like there was a reason we wanted to show you all those rainfall totals, because both of these two types deal with just really heavy rainfalls happening over short or long periods of time over an area that just cause systems to be overspilled, right? So in these, we're looking here at Mansfield, and we're thinking, right, we're sort of hypothesizing that this area, all those yellow dots are individual assistance that was reported through FEMA as a result of the 2016 storms. I think our tool is crashing. So, are you all right back there, Brad?
We got it.
Okay, cool. So I think one of the things we have to do is we've got to understand what is the source of flooding before we can think about what are the solutions we should enact, right? And if you know it's a municipal drainage issue, you're likely going to see pluvial flooding that's happening because your drains are not draining anymore. If your municipal system relies on rivers that are overspilling their banks and they're connected, right? Your solutions are going to be sort of a combo of how do we make our river systems work more effectively while also supporting our municipal drainage infrastructure. And so knowing where the flooding is coming from is very, very important when we think about designing solutions to those problems. Jennifer, do you want to add? Yeah.
You know, I definitely think that this type of flooding is probably the hardest to tackle. I'm sure Terry could attest to that. And it's also the hardest to deal with when we do have those events and water is getting into citizens' homes because they are living in, more of an urban area. They're not necessarily along a river, and they're not necessarily along the coast, and they probably have a lesser flood risk tolerance than those citizens who live along the coast and live along rivers. And so it's certainly a big issue that so many people are working to tackle locally, as well as trying to address it through things like development ordinances and things like that. And so certainly development has a large impact on this type of flooding.
Right, and it's, I would say, highly susceptible to changes that are happening in your urban or suburban landscape, right? So new development, but also I think, like you're saying, Jennifer, I think this is a really good point. We often think that if you're not located near a body of water, you don't need flood insurance and you're not going to flood, right? But pluvial flooding is like happening in a city that's not near a river. It's totally separate and independent from bodies of water overspilling their banks. It's happening in streets, and so I think we're seeing now more than ever across the state more instances of these types of flooding occurring, and people sort of wondering like what is going on. Like they're looking for why are we flooding now when we've never flooded before? And so these are the types of problems that we're going to want to discuss in more detail with y'all as we better understand what's going on in your cities, towns, and the regions. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think also what a benefit of this regional coordination, especially in areas that are developing more rapidly, hopefully we can, share our experiences and sort of maybe some of our lessons learned with some of the more northern areas who might be developing. And so I hope that's a benefit that comes out of this.
Yeah, and I think the mapping exercise, I think, really is going to help for y'all to sort of communicate what's going on in your communities, what effects do you think it's having, for us to be able to come back and say, like, is this an issue? Especially being able to take those concerns or potential issues and lay them into a modeling discussion, right? So we're in the process of working and with DOTD to stand up the modeling program, especially in those northern areas. And we can give them very specific questions about, okay, we've got a steering committee member who has a concern about the development happening here. We can ask them now, add more detail, make this more fine-grained so that we can assess these questions later on. So we want to make sure y'all take the mapping exercise it seems sort of loose, but it's very important that y'all sort of, isolate things that you think are of importance.
Did y'all give the lead to DOTD based on their funding ability, or why not Ghost Ship?
So we worked together to figure out which was the best. And I'll say that DOTD has a lot of experience in managing large contracts across the whole state, right? So their contracting and management of big, agreements, their ability to do like IDIQ, like engineering contracts, and their experience in handling that, I'll say it has sped up. Even though the procurement has taken, 8 months, it's made it go faster. And so a lot of it was about expediency. It was like, we can't wait to have one agency figure this out. Not to say that GOSEP would have to do that, but I think the experience DOTD has with working with engineering firms and large contracts made it where this was something that really fit within their wheelhouse, but also knowing that DOTD works in the northern portions of the state to manage the dam safety program and other flood insurance programs, that it made sense that they would also gain the capacity from working directly with those consultants on understanding risk throughout the whole state. So it's a tying together of a lot of different pieces at the state agency level. Does that make sense? A little bit?
Hey, Alex?
Yeah.
So, not used to this. So when you're thinking about these different sources of flood risk, whether it's pluvial, fluvial, or coastal, that can start to get you thinking about what kinds of what do you need to do to address the kind of flood risk that you're experiencing, right? Because if the source of flooding, for example, is pluvial, and that historically we're seeing flooding in the range of like 1 to 3 feet or a few inches, what needs to happen there is going to be very different than if you're dealing with like 7 feet of surge, right? Like the projects and the ways that you respond to the flood risk, it's important to consider what the actual source of the flood risk is. And in some cases, you're going to have all three, right? In your region, you're going to have all three. In some areas of your region, you're going to have all three sources of flood risk, all three kinds of flood risk. But it's just helpful sometimes. For me, I know that when I was in local government and we were dealing with a lot of like post-Katrina projects, we were elevating properties very high, even though a lot of those properties were repetitive loss properties from drainage issues. And so it got me thinking about, like, do we need to be doing a drainage improvement project, or do we need to be doing an elevation project?
Right.
And so it can just get you thinking a little bit, like, we have flooding and, water is water, but, like, where is it coming from can help you think about how do you mitigate it then in the best way possible, in the most cost-effective way possible for that type of risk.
Thanks, Miriam. That's totally right. I mean, I think a lot of us have worked in local government, and it's really easy to kind of want to address the squeaky wheel, right? The problem that you see in front of you that you're like, it's a culvert, I can just replace it. That's going to alleviate it there. But then you might actually see flooding one or two streets down their way. And so what we're stressing is the systems approach, right? If you understand the source of the issue, and you can communicate that to your residents, right? And say, like, okay, you're part of a bigger problem that we're trying to solve. Not only does it help you use your resources wisely, but it also helps you sort of build trust in government. We had to have these conversations a lot. I used to work in St. John, and like, if people could understand how they were related to their neighborhood and how their project tied into an overall improvement and see that they would benefit, they just had to wait a little bit longer, they were more willing to do that, versus like, we'll hurry up and do it, and then you've got 2 more people who are now complaining about flooding maybe 3 or 4 blocks down the road. right? We all know like sometimes replacing the culvert creates more problems because water is now moving that it didn't move before. But that's a very local example of that. They also manifest in varying degrees at the regional scale, which we know. So the next thing we're going to talk about, which I think is really important because, the language around risk and how it's traditionally been approached is important to understand so you can think about how you work within or amend those decisions, right? How do we make better decisions? Well, you really need to know how they're being made now to be able to think about how to move from that point and improve. Because without realizing it, you might actually be recreating the same wheel that's in place. And so we're going to talk a little bit about FEMA, and just so everybody's on the same page, they're responsible for mapping the nation's hazardous flood areas, right, the whole nation. And what we want to talk about is how they traditionally think about flood risk. And keep in mind, it might sound like we're being critical. We're not. They're our partners. They're our biggest resource for funds. Like you mentioned, GOSAP works closely with FEMA to get funds out to elevate homes, to do flood projects, to, put in our pumps and fund them, to pay for our safe rooms. So, by all means, they are partners. We're going to work together with them to address all these mounting flood risks statewide. But we also have to be sort of, constructively critical, right? There's always room for improvement. There's always way of rethinking, are we doing the things that we were originally set out to do effectively, or have we sort of gotten lost in some things and there's ways to find our way back to the original point we were all working, right? So to this effect, the floodplain maps, FEMA's floodplain maps, just so everybody's on the same page, they do provide the basis for flood insurance rate maps and for floodplain management regulations nationwide, right? On this map, you'll actually see in light blue, it's kind of hard to see, but the light blue areas are the special flood hazard areas associated with the 1% annual chance. And you'll notice that they're all around the river systems, right? The river systems are all those darker blue lines in the middle. All that light blue areas where FEMA is basically saying these are areas that are likely to be impacted by flooding during the 1% annual chance. And it makes these communities that are in those light blue areas aware of their flood vulnerability. And it also impacts the development, the built environment in those areas. If you build in those areas, you have to meet special regulations that are associated with these special flood hazard areas that are set up by FEMA. And then a lot of times communities will also enact or adopt higher standards to help their flood insurance premiums go down a little bit. They'll get like a little bump from FEMA for doing better than the minimum. So they're also known as sort of flood zones, right? So we also commonly refer to them that way. It's important to know, just to reiterate, this 1% chance, this is what we currently accept as our risk, right? So we're saying we're building to and we're regulating to the 1% annual chance. This is the storm that's going to hit as a 26% chance of hitting during your life of your mortgage. We're not planning for the 500-year event or the 0.2%, right? So we know about it, but we're not building to that standard and we're not assessing that in these maps. So that's important to acknowledge. In Region 4, it's worth noting that 40% of Region 4 is located in a special flood hazard zone, right? So that's a lot of land area, right? And most of the time, people want to live near the water, so there's a lot of development in those areas. Do you have a question, Jacob? Okay. Right? There's a lot going on. Oh, perfect.
That's okay.
Yes.
Being the representative for Rapides, can we zoom in on the boundaries? I don't know if some of the data is missing, if that makes a difference.
Yeah, let's zoom in and repeat.
So it's interesting that you start having a flood hazard area when you go south out of Rapides Parish. So maybe this is the one time they do follow political boundaries.
All right,
My
let's
guess is
go
that some
up.
of the data's not accurate.
I see it, yeah, that,
Right, they're paper maps still for Rapides.
I'm glad you're bringing that up.
Hey,
We'll
if you
have to
have-
see what we
just-
can do.
If you wouldn't mind turning the mic on that way, so we can do that.
Do I need to recap that, Alberto? We okay?
I think you should, just so
Okay,
everybody
for,
can hear. Makes us
anybody
accountable.
listeners' benefit, we're looking at the boundary between Rapides Parish and some of the adjacent parishes. It looks like the flood hazard areas stop at the boundaries, and we know they don't follow political boundaries. So we're about to address why some of the data's not showing up.
Right, and y'all have some paper maps that it looks like we've got to digitize some of that data. So I'm glad, good eye for seeing that. Right. Okay, so this is all part of why we're here, right? We need to make sure we're not missing information. So appreciate that, and we'll make sure we can get that incorporated. And that goes to show, like, we're talking about 40% of Region 4 is located in a flood zone. That's without, and we need to note, that's without REPEDS currently showing, so that number is likely to go up just a little bit. So we've also gone ahead and we've mapped 2 different flood zones. So it's important to acknowledge that we're showing A zones, they're in light blue, and V zones, which are represented in the darker blue, in order to differentiate the traditional types and impacts of flooding that FEMA considers, right? So we just talked about 3 types of flooding, but what FEMA does is they narrow them down into sort of these 2 big buckets. The A zones are likely to be impacted by that 1% chance event. They typically experience ponding-like flooding conditions, and also require you to purchase flood insurance, just to reiterate, and adhere to minimum floodplain building and land use requirements. The V zones are subject to coastal high hazard flooding, right? So these are in your coastal areas, and they're typically near larger bodies of water that are subject to tide and wave action. They're at a higher risk of damage and typically hold higher insurance premiums. For those of y'all who are, government officials or developers or planners, we're the ones who typically work with these maps a lot. We're very familiar with them to think about, like, where it is safe to build and how to build. There is an important challenge here to kind of hit the pause button and think about. Remember, CPRE's future flood risk maps, and remember how we looked at the 0.2% chance and how that risk profile increased, right? A lot more red, a lot more purple. FEMA's maps do not include future conditions projections, right? So they're not looking at what could happen, how subsidence is sinking our land and how sea level rise is raising. It's not looking at changes in rainfall. It's also not looking at expected population growth, right? So FEMA's maps are looking at what happened before and modeling historical storms. So when we think about flood risk, always remember that as we experience more intense rainfall events and more frequent rainfall events, that this really isn't how FEMA is projecting these maps. So it's not accounting for that additional risk. And so from the state standard, you'll notice that we typically tell you to plan for the worst case scenario, to kind of go beyond the FEMA standards, because we know that they're not thinking long term. So we want to make sure y'all are kind of on that same page. And also keep in mind that in this region, we have all these different, all of y'all are representing different parishes and areas of expertise, but that FEMA also struggles to keep their maps up to date. This is so important. I know Jennifer and I and Alberto and I talked about this. They try to update them every 5 years, but a recent investigation by the Department of Homeland Security's Interior Inspector General revealed that 58% of all FEMA maps were out of date. Right? They're not current, and so, or they're not accurate. And so it sounds like we're being critical, but we want to make sure is, like, when communities look at this, they need to know that they're not seeing all the risk, right? And they're not seeing it in an up-to-date format. And this makes it really difficult, right, for communities to be informed about their true flood exposure. And so this is one of the reasons why the state is investing so heavily into the mapping and modeling program, because we really need to understand this to be able to make smart investments. Jennifer or Alberto, do y'all have anything to add, or anyone else?
Sure, and I'll open up to everybody, but I think it's a pretty common theme where when you hear about folks that say, that flood, and they say, well, I wasn't in a flood zone,
Right.
I don't have flood insurance, but then again are repetitively flooding or a one-off. So that's something that I think is important for folks to understand, and one of our elected officials brought it up to me last week. He said that we need to inform people before they buy their homes, but it's really hard to do that because the developers are the ones that build it to the standard they're supposed to build it to, and the homeowner
they're using the
does not-
maps.
yeah, and they're using those maps, and the homeowner's not aware of that. So just open up discussion so that the state understands what other areas in the region are experiencing in addition to that one example of a common theme, I think.
Yeah, I think it's good to kind of hear from y'all if you're having these similar issues, right? These similar conversations of like, what is going on? My flood zone is X, which is like historically you've never flooded, right? You don't need insurance. If y'all are having the same experiences in your parishes or having these difficult conversations with residents who, didn't have insurance to rebuild after maybe damages from the 2016 events.
I think most of the residents, like the other day, we had 4 inches of rain in Grand Lake in 2 hours.
Right.
We had places flood that they said they never seen water. Of course, to all the residents, they go straight to the drainage board. Y'all got something messed up, they blame it on that. But they can't comprehend that, hey, I just had 4 inches of rain in 2 hours. And
Right.
without stopping. And that's what a lot of our residents are doing right now.
Well, and a lot of these systems just aren't built to handle that kind of input, right? And
Right.
so knowing your system's limitations, thinking about future projections, you can sort of start to plan on what improvements you need to make to be prepared for the next event like that, how long it's going to take. And then you're in a much better position to communicate to the public. You're aware of the issue. We're working towards it. This is a challenge we're facing, and that we're not unique, right? This is a challenge we're facing all across the country with these more intense weather
And other
events.
issues too, if the tide's high and you got a strong south wind and you get a big rain event, to the north end or in Calcasieu, you ain't gonna get that water out that quick.
Right.
You gotta wait till it switches.
We used to flood in St. John, and it wouldn't even have to rain. It would just be a wind, strong
Right.
wind, and you'd see all your canals raised, and people would be like sandbagging on a sunny day. And it's like you don't want to laugh, but you're like, this is incredible, like that these things are happening, and we really have to get our heads wrapped around what it means and how we work with these changing conditions.
Alex, in that same vein, you mentioned some of the homes in X zones that are now flooding that we're having to deal with. I'm vaguely familiar with the term of using the best available data to do some flood determinations.
Right.
Will all of this new data that we're going to have, will it replace the flood insurance rate maps? Is it a supplement?
This is a really, really good question. So we're working with DOTD, who has a very strong interest in seeing the modeling effort manifest in updated flood insurance rate maps, so communities have the best available data to make decisions about building regulations, to map out areas they may say, like, this is a floodway, this is areas where you shouldn't build at all. But I think what we're trying to do with the Watershed Initiative is work with y'all, understand where you're at, and and not sort of spring anything on you, and make this a foregone conclusion, because every community is different, and with these maps come obligations, right? And so we just need to be very clear about that, make sure the parish staff or the municipality understands what that means before we sort of enter that phase or those discussions. The modeling program, though, and the models that we're making are set up to do that, right? So if you have a community who is like, I think Sabine Parish, their last map was updated in 1991, right? So I think we would maybe want to start with Sabine and say, okay, how do you feel about updating your firm? And they may be like the first in line to say, we are the most out of date, we need to have better information, and in the best position to sort of spearhead that effort. I don't think we see it happening all at once, but I think we plan on working with parishes that are interested, setting really good examples, learning from them, and then sort of assuring other parishes that may be a little more reluctant to move forward with those obligations. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. I will say one of the things that we run into, and you guys have probably seen that as much as anybody, that we have paper maps that will show people in, and we've got these preliminary maps that we thought were going to be adopted over a decade ago, which to me are better available data.
Right.
But we're only allowed to enforce the paper maps. We can use the preliminary for education, or you use whichever one's more restrictive. And to me, that
Right, y'all's are 2007, your preliminary maps?
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
yeah.
So it'd be nice to have something that is the standard, that we use that to move forward on. And if it's based on really good engineering, good data,
Right.
it's kind of where we want to be.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. Yeah, we definitely singled out Sabine when we looked at everything. But I think that's really good to hear. And so we know they're not updated often. There comes with that a lot of challenges. And so it's important for y'all and for the coalition to know sort of traditional maps and then like how we plan on sort of investing in the mapping effort and why it's so important to the watershed initiative. When we think about the funding that's available, this 1.2 billion, we've got to make sure that every dollar is spent to solve problems that exist, that are using good data, good science, and that have the broadest possible impact that they can have on neighborhoods and communities in y'all's regions. Any other questions? Jennifer, did you want to weigh in?
No, I'll just add to this. I think we're definitely really excited to see what comes about from the Watershed Initiative and the modeling and the mapping that comes out and the data that would be available for citizens to go look at, even though, it would be wonderful if it, got rolled into firm updates and things like that. But of course, there's a process with that. But it would just be so great for citizens to be able to look and see what the real, a more accurate flood risk assessment is. So, right now, beyond it being some of the data being out of date or just estimated in a lot of cases on the firms, it's either you're in the flood zone or you're out in Calcasieu, but really flood risk is really a spectrum, and so it varies, and so it'd be great through this process have some better data available for citizens to look at.
That's right. That's right. And speaking of data, the next piece that we typically look at, or FEMA looks at when they think about grants and mitigating risk and how they prioritize, where the money is spent, the federal dollars are spent, they typically look at mitigating repetitive loss structures and severe repetitive loss structures for all of our floodplain managers. This is like a living and a breathing, like they do every day. But just for those of you who are new to these terms, your repetitive loss structures are those that have been flooded more than twice in 10 years, and the damages have been over $1,000, right? And so you typically see sort of an aggregate, these properties that experienced multiple storms. It could indicate that. It could also indicate like there's a local drainage issue where the flooding occurs. So this is something that's not around historic storms. It's more about who's bringing in claims, right? Where are your claims coming from? And what we're showing here on this map, there are privacy issues with showing FEMA data, right? So we can't show y'all like point to point where these properties are. So the areas that are darkest have the most repetitive loss properties. So those, you'll see in Cameron and in Calcasieu, you'll see you have like over 51 or over 113 properties in some of these areas. Those lighter blue areas are 22 to 50 repetitive loss claims are in those. These are all census blocks to kind of understand, and you can kind of see they're closer to the spines of those rivers, right? So along the river systems are where those census blocks are sort of lighting up. And remember, with the Sabine River, it's mostly in Texas, right? So you'll see it's at the bottleneck of the bottom part of the river where we're seeing more of these damages. And so this is a traditional way that FEMA looks at this. Jennifer, do you want to add, or does anybody else want to add any takeaways? I know this is a data point we use a lot with managing elevation grants.
Yeah, we work pretty much every day with folks who are repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures. And kind of going back to talking about the FEMA flood maps and the X zones and the AE zones, a significant amount of our repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss are in an X zone and outside the traditional flood zone. And so I would add that information. Certainly, looking at our severe repetitive loss structures over the years and being able to target those and really look at those as our problem areas, and kind of identifying potential projects and things like that. So we really use our RL/SRL information quite a lot.
And I would say like that's true across just from a statewide perspective. It's true across the whole coastal zone. So like Louisiana is probably one of the most informed and active group of floodplain managers in the country, right? Because our coastal zone is so often hit by hurricanes. We're so flat that our damages sort of are mounting, and so we have a group of professionals, floodplain managers, who are constantly looking at how to get or shorten their lists of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties, and that this is such an important job that we often don't realize even exists. And y'all bring so much capacity to these coastal parishes. and north, in the northern states as well. I mean, the northern parishes. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Another thing to consider, though, is so in order to be tracking repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties, they have to actually be carrying flood
Yes.
insurance. And so you may have folks that either, couldn't afford flood insurance, or if you don't have a mortgage, it's not required. So, like, we saw that in New Orleans, in Lower Ninth Ward, where a lot of folks there didn't have mortgages on those houses, they might have dropped the flood insurance because it was another extra few $100, and then you're not going to have coverage, and you're also not going to be appearing on these lists.
Exactly. So you're still getting sort of an underrepresentation of risk, even with repetitive and severe repetitive loss.
But we noticed that when we check the list, when we check the severe repetitive, and that some of the structures have been elevated, and it's still showing on the list. We found a lot of that.
Yeah, we got to work with y'all to update your list.
So the numbers ain't that accurate to me.
Right.
Already acknowledge it. Somebody
If I
was
could
going to
add
comment over
something
here.
real quick, one of the things I wanted to point out is Sabine River Authority has been using repetitive loss property stuff and getting FEMA grants and working down with Beauregard Parish and Sabine, down the Sabine River to buy out properties and move those people out so that they can spill water when they need to without flooding. The other thing I'd like to bring up, I work with Wildlife and Fisheries, so I want to make sure everybody's aware that there are environmental and species things that we need to be aware of when we start doing these projects. The Calcasieu Basin has the highest number of scenic streams in this entire state, and it's also home to both Sabine and the Calcasieu have species that are being considered for Endangered Species Act inclusion. So both those things are going to be important to remember when we move forward with projects. So I'm going to try to make every mean I can, and I'll help y'all, advise y'all on how that's going to work.
Absolutely, and this is something we talked about a lot. I mean, it's so complicated, and that was kind of my thoughts with DOTD, Lee. I mean,
Right.
DOTD may not be looking at what he's looking at. I mean, I'm in a soil and water district as well, so we work on longleaf restoration and stuff like that, and endangered, type species stuff. I mean, you're running the whole spectrum. I mean, we need places for people to live. We got to be able to produce fiber. We have to be able to produce food. Our wildlife treasures are, flora, fauna. And not only that, but in some cases, and this is something that we talked about a couple meetings ago, man, if you just start putting canals in certain places, now you may be running into legal issues with taking mitigation banks out of compliance, et cetera. It's I absolutely think we need Wildlife and Fisheries to be involved in pretty much, as a navigational beacon to help guide us on
Well,
some
and
of
we
this
can
stuff.
make sure, like, in y'all's future meetings, that we have someone from Wildlife and Fisheries in here. And I think, too, you're right, like, with DOTD, they do tend to take a more traditional approach to engineering and, like how to get from A to Z. And there is a little bit of a meandering that has to happen to understand how flow impacts ecological quality. And so we do, with the modeling effort, y'all should just know that, we have a technical design quality team that has USGS, that has Wildlife and Fisheries on it, that has USDA. Like, they're all on it, weighing in, and ensuring that I think we're getting the most out of the modeling effort when it comes to water quality issues, monitoring. Even with the Gauge network, we're working through DEQ and trying to put more water quality monitoring in the system where it makes sense and it's cost effective. I will say, like, as a program, we struggle with balancing discussions about flood risk mitigation and coupling it with all this working with nature and making sure that we're not actually compromising our ecological structures that we rely on for food and our economy while we try to save our homes from flooding. And so it's, I think, a constant balance that we're trying to strike, and that y'all recognize that is really important. So I'm so glad that you're here, and I think know that Wildlife and Fisheries participates in everything that we do, and we can try, I think, Brad, if we can make an effort to make sure that we've got, someone from Wildlife and Fisheries. We have a couple people in mind, but I'm not going to call them.
Alex, I can
Yeah.
make a point to this. I mean,
Perfect, Jennifer.
through all of our projects we've done, especially the ones on federal grants, we are going to have pages and pages of federal agencies, state agencies that we've had to get letters of no objections from, who've come back with comments, and we've got to adhere to all of this. That's kind of what makes these projects so complicated, is that there's going to be a lot of people involved with the say-so. And we've got to get a useful project that fits everyone's different requirements. And so it's going to go through this long process of everyone getting to take a look at it, from LDWF to DEQ to just everybody's going to take a look at these projects.
And we also have that, we're working on capacity building around sort of departing from traditional approaches to mitigation efforts. So like looking at riverine restoration and approaches to doing that acknowledge ecological quality and natural channel design, and approaches that will help to alleviate those potential negative impacts of flood mitigation projects. And so I think we're recognizing, like you're saying, there's a need for a larger discussion about working with nature and how to solve these problems without creating more problems. And so, we'll keep you in mind, Jacob. We might actually give you a call to kind of weigh in as we're about to roll this out, to say, like, do you think we hit the mark?
Yeah, I'm sorry, were you done with your comments?
Yes, I was. I'm sorry.
Okay. Man, the other balancing act is everybody's got an agenda. I mean, we work with Corps engineers all the time. I mean, the Corps' got an agenda. HUD's got an agenda. Everybody in this room's got an agenda. It's just, I really think it's important everybody talk. I mean, you might have a project that benefits 9 out of 10 parameters, and then a Corps of engineers comes in and says you can't do it because of whatever.
Well, and we're working really closely with the Corps too. So like, I think when you can achieve alignment early on, and you're having this conversation continuously, and you're developing projects together, it's less likely that will happen, right? Because they're weighing in early in the process and ensuring that whatever work they see needs to get done is incorporated in the project's design. I think you're right. People have things that they want to get done, but I think that just speaks to there's just a lot of work to be done in this space. And this is part of sort of prioritizing how that work gets done.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to add something. I understand, like, y'all go out and get comment from people and agencies on a project, and that's great.
Right.
When we step into the realm of threatened and endangered species, that's going to be a whole different new ballgame. It won't be, what can we do to mitigate that? It will be, can't do it.
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
So I just want to make sure everybody was aware of that.
And, well, I'll just acknowledge.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that part of what we're looking at later on is with our regional steering committee work plan. When we look at the governance model recommendation that we're going to have, that is probably our biggest task as a regional steering committee. All those things that we're talking about right now are what we need to include in that governance model, because it's things that other regions might not tend to think about, and it's something that is extremely important. So Wildlife and Fisheries, for example, brings a whole new level, a whole new layer of things to consider, and working on things on the front end rather than going through the process of getting a project through to just hear, no, you can't do it because of X, Y, and Z. And I think that's why what we're talking about is very important to include when we finally come up with that governance model at the end of the life of this steering committee.
Right. It is like a capacity. Like, do you have the right people to isolate these issues in advance, and then the authority to make sure that they're addressed, right, as part of that regional governance structure? That's a good point, Alberto.
So, and yeah, the chain of custody, the chain of command, the kill chain, whatever you want to call it. My thing is, I'm very, very sympathetic to what y'all do. But on the other hand, if that endangered species is a snail, and we need to get this project done to save 100,000 people's homes, I don't think that Wildlife and Fisheries should even have the authority to come in and shut a project down unilaterally.
It won't be the state, it'll be the feds. We don't have the authority either. So if they're adopted under the Endangered Species Act, then it'll be a Fed jurisdiction at that point. And
Yeah, but what
there
I'm
are
saying
some
is,
places, some things that you can mitigate for, a bird or something, for instance. The two species that are being considered are both mussels. So any sedimentation impacts, any changes in flow, any dredging in those rivers is going to impact those two species.
I get it, but I mean, steak versus sizzle. I mean, nobody thought that Waters of the U.S. was going to get repealed, and it did. You know what I mean? That's all I'm saying is to look at this.
Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm
As a
not against
whole.
what you're doing. I'm just trying to make sure that we have all
Like awareness.
the awareness
Right.
and decision capabilities so we can get forward. with
Heck
the
yeah,
best
everybody needs to
projects.
know that. If
Yeah.
mussels are being impacted due to sediment or whatever, that's absolutely a data point that everybody needs. And
Right.
That may be something somebody's not thinking about. But what I don't want is one agency who has an agenda, even as important as it is, to shut down something that would benefit,
That's not our priority. I mean, we're here to try to manage the species, and that's what we're hired to do. But I'm not here to step in y'all's way, just try to make sure we do it the best way we can.
Thank you. And don't misinterpret what I'm saying. It's not an attack on what you are doing. This is
Yeah,
just,
and if there's any way that you can make sure you complete the mapping exercise and isolate where those endangered species may be and like exactly what the potential restriction may be, I mean, like this is what we want to make sure we're capturing if we can.
I'll try. Some of that's unknown at this point.
Well, big area polygon, think like, because I think when we think about projects and we overlay the project inventory on this, we're going to want to contemplate like how these things are going to potentially interplay so that we don't end up with a project that gets derailed because of this potential issue, right? So understanding all these components and how they work together is going to be important to making sure we're using our time well.
Sure.
So thank you so much.
And a lot of this will then also factor into things like benefit cost analyses and stuff. When you're actually getting to the point of looking at projects, like this is where you're looking at some of how to weigh out those differences.
Hey, Alex, are we at a point where we could take a timeout right now?
Yeah, I think we are. We can take a break. Right? Feeling a little data drunk, right? All right, yeah, we'll take a 5-minute break. Does that work for y'all? What
We'll
do you
take a
think?
5-minute break, and we'll be back in 5.
All right.
All right, I think if we can reconvene to get started for, part two of the marathon.
Yeah, we needed a longer break than we thought.
Okay, well, now that everybody's getting situated again, and we'll let everybody get situated, and I'll hand it back over to Alex to continue doing a great
Alright.
job, by the way. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. It takes a village. You know, we have a lot of people working with the state on this. I mean, I can't tell y'all, I think with the technical advisory groups and the working groups, I know we talked about DOTD, we talked about wildlife and fisheries, but there's like 50 people across all 5 agencies working and thinking through how to represent these challenges to the regions to be able to work collectively to solve them. So I think, you know, by no means is it just, you know, me, Brad, or Ben. I think y'all heard him earlier on the Zoom. It takes a lot of heads thinking through this collectively to make sure we're identifying all these challenges appropriately. I think one of the things we talked about in our just a couple minutes ago was how a lot of these homes or residences or buildings are actually outside of the special flood hazard area, right? So like these, thinking about how FEMA maps aren't thinking about future flood risk, and they're looking sort of backwards about what are the historical storms, and then knowing that they're not updating the maps as often as they really need to for communities to understand what their true flood exposure is. What we've done here in this next slide is add the IA data, right? So these are the individual assistance requests from FEMA as a result of the March and August 2016 floods. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in and we're going to show y'all how a lot of these structures are just outside of the special flood hazard area. So you can see them sort of just floating right outside of those light blue areas. These are areas, so if you're outside of the special flood hazard area, remember, you're not required to have flood insurance, right? You're not required to build to a higher standard. It will lull you, right? It lulls you into a sense of safety, right? I'm outside of special flood hazard area. This is a low risk for me. I'm safe. And so I think what we want to make sure we understand is sort of the limitations that we talked about with the special flood hazard areas. And specifically looking at this one, remember that light blue area is the 1% annual chance event. So this is the less severe storm, right? This is the, I think the Harvey, you know, think Harvey and like the worst areas in this area, these areas, that was your 1% chance event. And there's a lot of challenges that we have to unpack with this, right? So people are frustrated, right? They didn't purchase flood insurance, right? So it's harder for them to recover after an event. They feel misled, right? And so as public officials, it often presents itself as a very, very difficult, challenging situation when you're having these conversations. And we're limited in terms of what we can advise people in terms of next steps, right? They think, I just bought a house outside a special flood hazard area. How do I know the next place that I buy is safe, right? How do I even make educated decisions about where to maybe relocate if I want to just move down the street or one community over, if what I'm relying on is the same set of information that I did originally, and I thought I was in an X zone or an A zone, and I wasn't subject to flood risk. And so, you know, I think it's important to call attention to this. I think we had a lot of these conversations after 2016. And I want to, you know, I know we opened the discussion earlier to, you know, did you have to have these conversations? Was it difficult? What did you learn? But I think, you know, we want to do that again as we look at this map and show sort of how real that looks, right? And when you zoom out, you see the damages around the rivers. It's just when you zoom in, you start to realize how they just missed the mark of being accurate enough to portray the true risk. Just keeping in mind, it's always important to have perspective. The 2016 storms were enormously impactful, right? They were a 0.2% storm, right? So the special flood hazard areas, just to remind y'all, it's the 1% that they're advising of. So I think we all kind of have these difficult discussions about what risk is acceptable, right? Do we plan for a 1,000-year storm, or do we plan for a 500-year storm, or are we okay planning for a 100-year storm? And so in this event, you can see it was more severe, but it's supposedly less likely to happen. And so knowing what those impacts could look like, taking this data, understanding it, and then I think we have difficult questions to ask ourselves about, is this an acceptable amount of risk? Are we willing to take that risk moving forward? Or do we look to preparing for a worst case scenario that could look like this and have less damages over the long term? And that could be different one community to the next, right? And so what we want to do with the initiative is make sure that communities understand so they can make these decisions, right? Consciously say, we want to build to the 1% chance event with maybe updated data, right? We want to use watershed initiatives maps, but we're okay with planning to the 26% chance that I'm going to have a storm like this hit during my mortgage. It sounds like really glossy, we want to use science and data, but it makes a really big difference. When people do get hit, they knew, right? They knew there was a chance. They made an active decision. It happened, but they can say, that's what I knew I was getting myself into. And I think that situation isn't playing out as much on the ground, and so you see a lot more frustration and a lot of misunderstanding and potential, finger pointing, right? Your system didn't work, my system didn't work. Who did what, and how do we fix this? And so, Jennifer, do you want to make a note here? Because I think, too, in our conversations with y'all, it's important to know, Brad, if you can zoom out. What we're showing with the 2016 events is this was, river flooding, right? So you're going to see all those IA data points where there were damages all along the rivers. And you'll notice that in Calcasieu and Cameron, they're like pretty much, well, I would say more so Cameron Parish was unaffected, or I would, arguably unaffected by the 2016 rain events. And so I just would ask y'all, as you look at this, to keep in mind that repetitive loss data, right, that had Cameron lit up as having the most impacted parishes. And this dynamic between river flooding risk and coastal flooding risk, you have to kind of put those things together to really think about how the region sort of performs as a whole.
The only thing I would add, and this was the comment I had made when we kind of first went through this, and to really reiterate, is that this is just one example of a data set that a local government or a regional group can go look at. So it's not the end all be all, but this is really good data. But it's only one of many different kinds of data sets out there.
Right, and it only tells the story of one event, right? So we did request, just so you know, Jennifer, the Harvey data. We're having issues getting it. So like the Harvey data will show the damages that are coming up from the coast. And so to be able to turn on one and talk about like riverine flooding and then turn on the other and see damages associated with the storm, I think you start to see that interplay and the neighborhoods that are sort of more likely to be impacted more clearly.
Just a note, 65% of the structures from this storm were outside of the special flood hazard area, March 2016 storm.
Right. And I think we had over 1,172 homes impacted in Region 4. And so just, I think to couple Brad's statement, only 35% of them were in the special flood hazard area. So think about how 35% of your damages are in the flood zone, 65% are outside. And you kind of sort of see there's sort of a lopsided, people are kind of making the decision not to live super close, and they're moving outside a little bit, but they're still in the area of risk. Right, exactly. All right, Brad. Am I missing anything else, Brad?
You're perfect.
All right, good. And then I think we want to make sure we take a moment and we think about and recognize sort of the natural systems that play into the region. And this is just really, I think, the very start of this conversation. And acknowledge that, wetlands all throughout Region 4, they act as natural sponges, right? They will slow water, they will retain water, they will hold water, they will clean water, right? So to depending on what your issue is, I think we have to start to sort of ask ourselves, and I'm sure some of y'all are already doing this actively with Soil and Conservation and with the Sabine River Authority. How can we utilize these natural resources to solve these problems and match up projects and design projects to utilize and enhance the wetlands functions? Because a lot of times you may not realize it. You may have a wetlands that is sort of being starved, needs active water circulation, and you may have flooding that's happening nearby. You could just recharge that area by diverting water in the right way. And so what we want to do is sort of explain this as an option. And as we think through project design, we have a separate program that we're working on now that speaks more directly to building out this toolkit of what are your options? What are other ways to think about mitigating risk through natural functions? And Brad, did Ben say anything about having Wildlife and Fisheries unmute themselves and talk via Zoom?
Hey, Alex, Ben Wicker here.
Perfect.
Robbie Maxwell is going to jump on the line and just kind of walk through some of the
Perfect.
comments that we had. Robbie, you there? Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, we can. Okay, I had to unmute myself a couple times. So Sean did a good job addressing some of the concerns about endangered species, and I was just going to go a little bit more in depth. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Robbie Maxwell. I'm in the data and modeling tag in the LWI. I'm at Wildlife and Fisheries. I'm a technical advisor for Inland Fisheries. And I actually should be up there right now because I work out of Lake Charles office, but I had a pretty big delivery coming to my house today that I had to be here for. So the next time I'll be able to meet y'all, and I look forward to that. But I really just wanted to say that, like Wildlife and Fisheries, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and DEQ, and the other kind of environmentally minded agencies involved, our goal isn't to be stopping projects. I mean, that's not the forefront of what we're seeing at all. We do want to bring our perspective and possibly, and let everybody else know what that is while we're going forward. We really want to identify projects that can enhance flora and fauna as well as, reduce flood risk for people. And that's very possible. It's happening all over the country. And we would really like to highlight projects to do that for a number of reasons, because I think everybody wins. And really economically, I think there are better projects, too, on top of it. So it's not necessarily an either or. It's not we're trying to either save people or save, fish or snails or mussels or whatever. We can do both, I think. And we're not just representing, the actual animals and plants out there. Our constituents also are recreational users and commercial users, which the state, as all y'all know, has a huge commercial fishery that really depends on water quality and how much water or what kind of water is in a place at a certain time of year. So we're really looking out for all those interests too. And really, just in the end, on the endangered species, I don't see a lot of projects just stopping just because of endangered species. Sometimes we have to alter how we do things, but usually if people are saying an endangered species stopped a project, and I'm working on something, I've been monitoring and commenting on something out of state that does affect Louisiana, but endangered species is involved. But I can tell you there's a lot more issues other than just the endangered species that could slow down or stop that project. If these types of projects do get stopped, a lot of times what you hear is, this owl or this fish stopped the project. But I can tell you from experience, some of these projects don't even meet their intended goals. So I want to be very careful where if a project does stop for, flood risk reduction, and if an imperiled species is involved, let's be sure that, if it does get stopped, we're upfront and clear about why, because there's a really good chance a lot of times what people think might reduce flood reduction doesn't even do that. And it's a lot easier to say that it was endangered species that stopped that than, the project we wanted to do wasn't going to do what it wanted to do. So I don't know, I just wanted to clear a couple of things up, and I appreciate Alex and what all y'all are doing in the steering committee.
Thanks, Robbie. It's good to hear your voice. Yeah, I'm glad he was planning on coming. So I think we'll see more of Robbie in Region 4. in all of our conversations. I think this is an important thing for y'all to sort of know, that this isn't just one, it's just not one agency. It's a sort of a choir of agencies. And while we all have different missions, we respect that within the Watershed Initiative, we'll do this work better together, and solve more than one problem as we move forward, and not have sort of unintended consequences, right? Undermine each other's, work by doing one thing and not really realizing somebody else is planning something else. So thanks so much, Robbie. The other piece is I think what we want to overlay too, as y'all consider, managing water in region 4 is people, right? So people are really at the center of this, right? We talk about nature, we talk about risk, we talk about damages, but people are vulnerable, right? And what we see over time is, the most vulnerable people in our society are often the hardest hit by natural disasters, right? They may be renting, they may not have flood insurance, they may not have an automobile, they may be disabled. And so what we're seeing here is the CDC's social vulnerability impact. And as we think about mitigating flood risk, we really need to understand, who we're helping, right? Who are most at risk, how we're helping them, and that with the CDBG, these HUD funds, the first sort of funds available to the Watershed Initiative, are really mission-oriented towards supporting socially vulnerable populations, right? Your low and your moderately income populations, and also those that have sort of health risks and all these other things that make them more vulnerable. So what this is capturing are your sort of socioeconomic status, your income, right? Your household composition and disability, right? Single parents, those types of things, disabilities, your minority status and language. Maybe you don't speak English, housing and transportation. Maybe they don't own a car, or they're renting, or they're receiving some sort of subsidy from the federal government. And so what that sort of suggests is sort of a level of sort of instability, and that instability is further amplified in the wake of a disaster. And so if we can sort of reduce those damages and reduce that instability, we should focus on projects that can do that, and sort of maintain our social fabric and be more resilient after a disaster. And so just so y'all are clear on the way this works is that the census blocks are sort of combined, and the smaller the census block, the more dense the social vulnerability is. So there's more socially vulnerable people located in the smaller census blocks, and you have the highest social vulnerability in those areas that are red or sort of medium, sort of orange. And so you'll see sort of where you have maybe your towns, some of your urban centers, that that's where you have your most socially vulnerable populations. And what we want to be able to do today is sort of overlay this, and I think the next slide does this, Brad. It overlays damages, social vulnerability, and your special flood hazard areas. So you can start to look through a collective lens how all these different data sets can sort of combine to either like create the perfect storm, right? Where you would want to spend a lot of your time thinking about how do we reduce these vulnerabilities or this risk. Let's see, Brad, what's the next slide? I think the next slide has the filter.
We already had our break, so we'll just keep going.
Right, thanks, Brad. We'll be working out these kinks for the next one. Y'all are first, right? So we're a little bit more flexible. And so what we're going to ask y'all to do after this meeting is to perform this mapping exercise. And so what you'll see is, I think, if you take a look here, you'll see how the data sets are overlaid. You can see the special flood hazard areas, the damages, the IA damages from the 2016 storms.
Can you go to Lake Charles?
Yeah. Right. And you can see the social vulnerability index. Let's see. And what we've done is we've created inserts So like you'll actually have screenshots of all of these so you can take them home with you and write on them and think through what are the implications, where should we be prioritizing our time or designing projects or thinking about how we manage these systems to resolve these issues. And I think from the state's perspective, right, we're really looking at where your social vulnerability overlaps with special flood hazard area, overlaps with damages that are happening outside of the special flood hazard area, right? These are the people who are sort of most vulnerable, who have the least resources to recover. But we're going to open it, I think, for discussion at this point, to see if y'all want to kind of zoom into other areas, or we can talk through the directions for the mapping exercise. What do you think, Alberto?
Sure. So what we had talked about, because it is a lot of information,
It is.
Is to go through the way the mapping exercise works, so that all the steering committee members can hear that, and anybody tuning in, so that everybody's on the same page and have the ability to go and talk to the folks in your area that you know are experienced, that know the problems, whether it's elected officials, local engineers, whether it's, floodplain managers, planning commissions, you name it. Everybody's got their different people, and your area, and be able to gather as much information to provide a comprehensive look at what you experience outside of what we already know, to enhance the data, and so that we can make better decisions as a steering committee, and so we can provide the best recommendations to the state when it comes to governance and when it comes to projects and decision-making processes and stakeholders. So I'll just turn it over to go through the instructions, and hopefully this was kind of our take-home homework for us and anybody else in our community that you want to loop in.
That's right, Alberto. And so what you'll need to find is there's a sheet in front of you that says Region 4 Flood Risk Presentation Group Mapping Exercise, and it says, let's draw, right? And just to kind of summarize, the goal of the exercise is to identify communities or areas within your region that are at risk of flooding, which will help inform future regional steering committee work. And this is like to say to, like we mentioned, adding the IA data from Harvey. If there was a specific event that you'd like to know, or have more data on, or if you use a data set that we're not showing here, that's really important to water quality, or, just let us know, because we realize that, apart from flood risk, there are all these other water-related concerns or issues that y'all may have. We want to make sure we're understanding where we can see those sort of secondary benefits occur. And so what we'll do is we have, you'll need just, the maps, which are here, but they'll also be linked on the website. Some, markers or pens, some Post-it notes or stickers. And basically what you'll need to do is kind of look through the presentation. It'll be available at watershed.la.gov/watershed-regions. Follow along with the mapping exercise, and you can draw on the maps in your packet. The maps include in Region 4, Mansfield, Logansport, Leesville, Starks, and Lake Charles. And basically just add your input on the maps. You can draw or write on them. And I think some of the questions that we want to sort of use to spur conversation is, which areas can you circle and label that either flooded or almost flooded in the past events? Which streets may be submerged in a typical flooding event? And sometimes, these are areas that don't have structures, right? So think through that piece, right? So if you have areas that store water that are important for storage where nothing is, like that's something that we would want to say, like maybe it shouldn't be developed because then that water has to go somewhere. So storage areas are important to sort of identify and flag. What is the source of flooding, right? If there's an area that floods or is unique and that, there's a transition zone or what areas flood outside of the flood zones? Like, so if you're not seeing the IA data, but people flooded in a storm that was significant in that region, we can try to see if we can't highlight that and better explain what happened. And I think too, what we're really interested in that the data may not capture is, what has changed in the area over time. This is where y'all's experience really comes into play. Has there been an increase in development? Was there, a road put in? Has there been a lot of concrete or, where there were things used to store water? And I think, too, we also want to know what specific issues or concerns do you have that weren't addressed today, right? So we talked a lot about working with nature. We talked about endangered species. Maybe you have issues with road construction or the standards at which projects are developed or, communicating flood risk, apart from FEMA. So let us know. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to give y'all until June 29th. So it's 3 weeks from now to either scan your maps and email them to watershed.la.gov, or you can actually place them in this prepaid envelope. So you don't have to scan them. You can just put them in the envelope and they'll come to us. And I think too, there's kind of a broader, I want to make sure y'all fully understand where this is going, right? Because this is going to take some time. Alberto mentioned sort of comprehensive analysis. I would also say, if your perspective is I just want to rant about this issue, that's okay too, right? You can take these maps and you can mark something down. If you're a baker and you're frustrated because something's being built, it's okay just to download the map, write your concern, and send it in to us. It doesn't have to be technical engineered input, right? We want sort of all voices and for this to be sort of very transparent and accessible process to the public, so we can sort of combine those voices and see collectively what this looks like. And what it'll do is, I think we're going to take this information, we're going to use it in a couple of ways, right? So to be clear, we're going to use it to sort of, I think, report out what we heard, right? There is in your papers in front of you, there's kind of to give you an example, there's a listening tour, Region 4, building on regional input, one pager, what we heard from technical professionals back in 2018. This is what we imagine we'll do just as a summary, some key points, and you might not think this is very important, but it is. There are really important points that came out of this that shaped the program. One of them was the state should adopt legislation that provides a framework for doing this, right? So that's literally what we're doing with the steering committees. Another one that came from y'all's region was the state needs to organize the watershed regions because the regions won't be able to do this on their own. We're operating in provisional boundaries as a result of these recommendations. So I think it's really important that y'all see we're listening. We're doing more than that. We're implementing the recommendations that are coming out of y'all's region. And I think this next stage, this mapping exercise, we're gonna hear from more people, right? Not just the technical professionals, but make this available to the public. So if you know of someone who has an interest in this, isn't here, forward them the link to the exercise, encourage them to do it so we can hear from them. Another way that you might see this used is actual new data added into this tool, right? So additional data sets that you request, additional points. And then I think too, what we'll be doing with this tool long-term is helping to guide your regional strategy, right? Your regional long-term strategy, your planning efforts, helping to direct, additional detail potentially with the modeling work. So there are a lot of ways that this information is going to be used and useful to y'all in making sort of decisions and helping to direct the effort. And so does anybody have any questions, concerns?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Do we have to use these maps provided, or can we download our own SFHA maps and comment on those?
You
for
can-
certain other areas?
Right, so we're trying to make it easy for you, but you can we'll take what you will give us, right? Right? We're trying to make it where you can just simply, but if you have that capacity, that's wonderful. All right. Any questions? Cool. Okay, so what we'll do, I know, Brad, can you see any of the information in the chat box? Because we can't see it. He's checking. So the whole time we've been talking, because we're on Zoom, there's the chat box. I just want to make sure y'all know what I'm talking about. And I think there's been dialogue. So for anybody who's chatting on Zoom, just know we weren't able to see it, so we're not ignoring you. And so you can see, y'all, just for your reference, all the state agency folks, we've been directing them to participate virtually, so you'll see a lot of those folks listening in, hearing your concerns, being more aware of what's going on in Region 4. I'm seeing, Alberto, do you see any questions that we may want to answer while we're here?
I don't. I
No?
don't see any questions
Okay, great.
from the chat.
All right.
Okay.
I think that's it, and we'll just turn it over back to y'all.
Okay, so that was a whole lot of information, and, and we appreciate everybody's, whether it's the state, all the consultants that are involved in putting all this together, our OEP staff and our communications and media staff who got with the state to make all this technology work and interactive while also engaging the public. That's very important, and I want to recognize those that are working in little control boxes back there and upstairs, working the cameras and things like that. But I do also want to acknowledge that this is one of the steps in the process that the regional steering committees do have to go through, or are strongly encouraged to go through. Region 4 is first, so that's, we wanted to be first, but so more to come on that. So at this time, I'll entertain a motion to receive the report that was provided on Region 4's regional flood risk. Got a motion by Mr. John Marceau,
And I'll second.
second by Ms. Mossel. Any discussion? Any objection? That motion will carry. Do we have any updates from OCD at this time, or is that pretty
I
much?
think it would be a good opportunity, I think, just to reiterate the status of the funding and round one. I know a lot of, it's been a while with COVID. We've been sort of socially distant, and just because we're quiet doesn't mean we're not working hard on this. So just keep in mind, as of right now, we have not yet received the grant agreement with HUD, and that is preventing us from accessing those funds. So there's been sort of a lot of pressure to sort of start funding projects, start moving round one forward. And I just want to make sure everybody understands that the reason we haven't moved round one forward is because we don't actually have access to those funds yet. And that we've sort of, as a state, done everything in our power to be prepared for when the funds are available, while also managing this situation where there are a lot of small communities, right, that are looking to put project applications into round one and are very dependent on being able to be reimbursed for the application work, right? And so we've held off opening the full application period because we can't reimburse small, just anyone until we've had that grant agreement with HUD. So it's out of this desire to sort of keep an even playing field, enable local smaller communities to submit, and make sure that this is as competitive as possible for everyone who's participating in it. We do expect, once we get the grant agreement with HUD, to hold either a special meeting or a council meeting there shortly thereafter, issue a press release, an e-blast advising that it's open, and providing applicants at least 3 months to put in their applications. Because, we're talking about flood mitigation projects. These are complicated projects that require a lot of justifications to make sure there's no unintended consequences. We want to make sure everybody has plenty of time to do this well, so we can get really good projects out of this first push. So I think those are the two things I would just want to make sure everybody is aware of, because it has been kind of quiet. And that's it.
All right, do you have any questions on that? There's no action needed there. So we'll move on to item 8, consideration and take appropriate action on the annual work plan for Region 4 Regional Steering Committee. It's included in your packets, the draft plan for consideration. One of those is this flood risk presentation that is in there, so for June 15th. So before we take any action on that, I just want Jennifer Cobian to hit a couple of high points on that, so that we all have a good understanding of what this is.
So this plan right here is really just an outline and an overview of the goals of this committee and sort of a timeline. This is a working plan, so this is obviously the goals right now. For example, the round one project funding recommendation is to be determined, because that we'll kind of start a clock after that grant agreement. Then we know we can kind of work backwards from there. But we're trying to get as much information as we can on paper as to what y'all can expect over the next several months. it's broken out into, obviously, the first set of goals, which we've already achieved, is into number 1. And then we've got number 2, 3, and 4. And number 4 is the Regional Watershed Coalition Development. I've backed some of those dates up, just so y'all will know when y'all are looking at this. I just want to kind of give us a little bit of cushion in case something like the COVID-19 closures or something unexpected happens, and we've got to miss meetings for a couple of months. So I have pushed that back to where I'm giving us plenty of time to be able to get that done. So if y'all have any questions, just let me know. And as we update this, we'll definitely send it out to y'all.
Do you have any questions on that? So then I will entertain a motion to approve the annual work plan as proposed.
I'll make that motion.
All right, we have a motion by Mr. Marceau and a second by Ms. Fontenberger on behalf of Steve Brown. Any discussion? Any objection? That motion passes. Item 9 is a general discussion or update from each parish and tribe regarding this initiative. We'll start with Allen. Well, Allen Parish is not here. We'll go to Beauregard. Anything?
I just want to announce, I guess, that Mr. Joey Bro is now Director of the Office of Soil and Water Conservation. And maybe, I don't know if y'all know him.
Very well.
Okay, good. So he's gonna, our problem in Beauregard is we have one part-time engineer, and Office of Soil and Water Conservation is there to provide technical assistance. That's one of their mandates. So Joey and his crew is going to help us out with some stuff, and so maybe some of the other, not necessarily just rural parishes, but parishes that are limited on resources to get some of this stuff done, particularly with like floodplain conservation and green space type stuff, like we're trying to do. That would be a good resource to help out. Comments complete.
All right. Calcasieu, I don't have anything to add unless somebody else from Calcasieu does.
I did want to mention that, so Alberto and I are kind of working as the interim watershed coordinators as part of that regional capacity building grant until we can actually go out and hire our actual watershed coordinator. And we are advertising for that in the next couple of weeks. We're going up for police jury approval to be able to advertise for that. So you'll see maybe some of that coming out, and over the next few weeks, hopefully we can go ahead and get someone hired, and they'll be able to kind of come in and really work as that watershed coordinator and move some of this further along.
Anything else from Calcasieu? Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to Cameron.
Which one?
Well,
I
she's
do
an
have-
at-large. She's
I do-
at-large, so she's the whole region.
Right. I do have a comment, Alex. On the modeling efforts, are they considering maybe studying separating the Calcasieu and Sabine Basin?
So they are, like I would say what we showed were the two big river basins, and what they'll be modeling at is the Huck 8 basin, so it's smaller. So they're nested, so you actually will have multiple models that come together to create each of those river basins. So yeah, they're gonna be,
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
no problem.
All right, that's it for Cameron. All right, let's see. Skashada's not here. DeSoto, anything? Nothing from DeSoto. Jeff Davis.
No, I don't have anything to report. Alex Guillory, do you have anything from Jeff Davis? Can you think of anything I'm missing?
Not at this time.
Okay. No.
Okay. Rapides.
No report.
No report. Sounds good. Sabine and Vernon are not here. Again, I want to thank everybody involved in this presentation and getting us to this point. I know it took a lot of work and a lot of coordination and communication back and forth, especially during COVID. We're able to finally meet in person again, which is great. I think this would have been very hard to do virtually. So I'm glad we had our folks willing to come here to get this done in person. So that being said, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Motion by Mr. Johns,
I'll second.
second by Ms. Bonsall. We are adjourned.